Test. Yeah, it works. I will sit down already in my comfortable chair, and before I ask the other discussions, which are much more important today than I am, to join me on stage. Thank you a lot, Alex, for the invite. It was a big challenge for me. It was on quite short notice, no problem, but I'm not a professional moderator whatsoever, but I'm really passionate for social media research in the context of also education for sustainable development, climate change, and chemistry education, so I will do my very best to have a fruitful discussion. We will talk about different aspects in the sub-projects of SoMeCliCS, usage, literacies, and interventions, and you will probably recognize a lot of aspects that we have talked about today. For this, we have invited a broad range of very interesting people, also being passionate for social media. And may I invite on stage Thomas Schubatzky, Kerstin Kremer, Shakked, Dabran, Hannes Balk, and Jonas Wagner. And I will introduce you these people in a minute. So please join me. Yeah, this looks much better. And I will just start with Jonas. So Jonas is a teacher here in Hannover for biology and English. And he wrote me that he deals with the risks and chances of social media in the classroom on a daily basis. And I'm very interested to hear more about that. And then we have Shakked Dabran from the Technion in Israel, a very famous institution. She's a PhD student, and she says that in an age where misinformation and also conspiracy theories are becoming increasingly common, her PhD research is aiming at examining how science literacy is helping address challenges in the post-truth world. Close to me, we have Hannes Balk, and Hannes is a student, 12th grade student here also from Hannover, and he's an activist in Fridays for Future, and we just talked about how difficult it is to really establish some new structures in the Fridays for Future movement after the COVID-19 pandemic. On the left, we have Kerstin Kremer. She's a professor for biology education at the University of Gießen, not very far away from here, and she's dealing with communication, also in social media, and nature of science research. And then on the very left, we have Thomas Schubatzky from Innsbruck. He's an assistant professor for physics education, and one of his research areas as well is the development of resilience against fake news and misinformation in the science classroom. So we have a broad spectrum from the school context, but also from the research context, and I'm really curious about the different perspectives. Before this panel discussion, I did some research myself in social media, and I went on Instagram and searched for the hashtag climate change. And I found round about 8 million posts. So climate change is a very hot topic in not only Instagram, but the other social networks as well. And this would actually be my first question, and maybe we can start with Thomas here. So how would you say, how are people using social media in the context of communicating about climate change or dealing with climate change in general?
Yeah, thanks very much for the question, which is a very broad question, so I will keep my answer maybe broad. I think there are a lot of ways to connect in social media and talk about climate change. Especially, you already mentioned the hashtag. I think this might be one of the major factors that connects people about this topic. When you think about hashtag climate strike online, which was very big during the COVID time, or when you think about climate action challenge or something like that. So I think hashtags are something which is worthwhile to talk about when communicating online. And the funniest example for me was when there was the protest in Lutherschule about the topic of climate change. This even led to an arrest from one person, I think in Romania, that was linked with a pizza box or something like that. So this shows also the complexity of and the widespread effects that communication on social media can have.
Okay, so this was like a negatively perceived example with the arrest. Hannes, do you maybe have a positive example on how social media maybe enriches your communication within Fridays for Future?
Social media can also be very empowering. So there's not only negative information now about how bad climate is changing right now, but also about all the positive things, just seeing the pictures from Lutherschule, for example.
Thank you very much. Jonas, if you think about your students maybe in school, do you have some more examples about maybe positive or negative effects on their environmental or climate change related behavior connected to social media? So what's on your mind when you think about that?
The first thing that comes to mind is that in general students have to learn how to use social media in general. Yeah, so climate change already is very specific and is more interesting for people close to the Abi, more or less. So in school I'm very much confronted with the risks and dangers and misuse of social media. Yeah.
Kerstin, can you maybe add up on this from your research perspective about communication? So what would you say, maybe balancing out the factors that have been already mentioned from your point of view?
Yes, I think what was already mentioned by you both fits very well to our results from the usages sub-project. There's Soraya and Alex, we work together and look upon how students perceive social media. And in this project, we try to find a very broad range of different young people's perspectives on social media and climate change. And we interviewed, on the one hand, activists, so Fridays for Future activists, and on the other hand, students with so far not yet being so much in contact with activism at all. And we see this whole broad range. So on the one hand, the ones who are very familiar even to the background of climate sciences, when they are interested and they are researching very specifically, then it is a great chance for young students to get very closely connected to very good information in the social media, and even to get in contact with the experts if they are able to identify the experts and to extract the information. But on the other hand, there's a broad range of getting possibly confused, and this is the whole spectrum that we are facing at the moment, and that we have get answers from the research perspective on our side, but at the other side, of course, from the practical perspective in the classrooms, where you're not able to specify if a student is already informed or what is the background of the specific students. That's a very big challenge, I suppose.
Yeah, maybe if I can add to that, it's not only being informed, it's more like being aware of how to use and how to look for information. And a big part of being a teacher or teaching social media or in general digital things in school is to teach children how to be aware of the usage, and how to be aware of risks, because it seems mostly that students find it hard to avoid risks because they don't know it's a risk. Just for an example, I was asking my students in class for their screen times. My screen time was pretty high, I guess, on like an average of like 3.5 hours a day, which I think is quite high. But the highest amount, like the highest screen time in my class was over 10 hours. And considering that cell phones are forbidden in school. So just,
Yeah, so you're just in the very average number, because I think the average number of screen time is about 250 minutes per day, which is a lot, but 10 hours is really a lot. And before we get more into this connection between maybe research and practice a little bit later, maybe we should clarify some terms. And I wanted to ask Shakked, so in this public discussion, and we just talked about it also in the plenary, people often talk about fake news, echo chambers, bubbles, and so on. So can you elaborate a little bit on what that is and in which way such mechanisms can be problematic for communication and social media in general?
And it's kind of connected to what Jonas. Yeah, sorry. Jonas said in what we need to teach kids to be aware of, because we those terms are coming from mostly from psychology. There are cognitive bias that might influence people in the way they enrich information online. So for example, echo chambers is coming from the confirmation bias, when people are looking for information that it's familiar to them, that there are belief in them, that make them feel comfortable with what they already know. And we need to be aware of this kind of phenomena. Now, it's really hard to educate someone to not look for information that he wants to find. But if we teach them how to notice that these echo chambers, these bubbles are existed, it might help them to not fall into the rabbit hole, and then they're really trapped into the misinformation and into all the fake news and disinformation and all the post-truth phenomena that might influence their decision making. Now, a lot of researchers are saying that we need to teach it in a very young age, because then people don't have this kind of belief system that adults already have. But at the beginning we said kids are digital native, in which they born into the digital environment, but they don't know how to use it well. It's different to be born into a society that use digital and to know how to use it well, and we have the responsibility to teach them how to do so and to be aware of these kind of responsibilities and what might affect them when they're looking for information. And unfortunately, misinformation, as Frederica said before, traveling very much faster than real news, because emotions play a really big part in it. And researchers in different areas proved that, for example, in Twitter, fake news were reshared much faster and broader than the real news. And it's important to learn how to engage with information online. Other cognitive biases that might influence is the bandwagon bias, which is the amount of shares, the amount of likes that we can see on the social media that might influence people to believe it, because if a lot of people say that it's true, it might be true. We need to be aware of this and to look for more information when we read the content, and that's where the literacies and the education and the competencies came to help us.
Yeah, this is a great transition to talking about literacies. But before we do that, actually, when Kerstin was talking about also the chances and the potential of social media, I thought of a question I really want to ask Hannes, namely, would the type of activism that you are doing within Fridays for Future be possible without social media, or how would it be different?
I think the kind of activism we're doing right now would be possible without social media, but it would be a lot more difficult. Well, first of all, in Fridays for Future itself, we have like a server where we communicate, and obviously WhatsApp groups where we communicate together about our projects, where to meet, when to meet, but also on the other hand, the communication to the outside world from Fridays for Future. So when the protests will start, where they will start, and again, the empowering of the people taking part in protests is very important, so that you give the people the feeling that they're doing something important and something that is correct and right. So social media really helps in that. It would also be possible with just the posters we hang up, but I don't think it would have that effect as it has right now.
Yeah, thank you very much. So it seems that we have young people that have a lot of screen time that you're dealing with in school, and they can use this screen time for something positive, but they also encounter a lot of mechanisms that they have to learn how to deal with. And as you said, that requires a set of literacies, which can also be and should be promoted by research. So that's, I think, a good wrap-up so far. And also, like I said, a good transition to the question about the literacies that are important to deal with social media mechanisms and climate change. And this would be, again, but it's a coincidence actually, a question to Thomas. So what do you think students should need to learn in, let's name it, modern education for being competent in social media, also in the context of climate change?
Also a very complex question, I think. And I might relate it to a study I did with a colleague of mine from Graz, where we did some expert interviews with persons that are related to misinformation actually in social media, and we asked them exactly this question basically. What do you think are important competencies students need to know? And one of the first things many of the people, I remember a quote from a famous investigative journalist in Austria. He responded when he said, well, it's not only to talk about what literacies, but also who should be literate. Because also you mentioned first we need to teach students, and those are digital natives. And I think they might be even ahead of us as teachers or as researchers. So it might be, before we talk about which literacies, it might be worthwhile to talk about how can these literacies be developed by students and teachers alike, for example. And the quota I want to mention, because I found it very funny, was he was saying, well, we are operating these social media machines and they are like a rocket, a space rocket, while we have only learned to drive a free wheelchair. And that might be something worthwhile to think about when you live in a world where you deal with media for 30 years. Well, not for me, but for the people, the person that mentioned that. And then certainly the media landscape is completely changing. And that's, I think, where media literacy then comes in the picture, and where you need to think about how we need to deal with these changes in the media landscape. And so media literacy might be something worthwhile to look for.
Yeah, Hannes wants to.
Well, I have also thought about the literacies that are needed to understand our world as it is right now, especially on climate change. And I think the most important thing that is sometimes overlooked is that we need to learn how to break out of our bubbles. Because one thing I have noticed in the last couple of years in our schools is that there's different groups of people with different political views and completely different political views. And they don't always completely disagree on a topic, for example, climate change, but they have a completely different view on it. For example, when the last Bundestag was voted, we all got the vote advertisements from different parties. And one thing that I really memorized was when we had two, especially in some of my friends from different school told me that they had two different groups of FDP, fans, and they had opposing views on climate change, although they were fans or supporters of the same political party. If part of them said that the FDP is pro climate justice and trying to solve climate change by, for example, letting the free market find solutions for that problem, and the other one said that the FDP is trying to is not really that focused on climate change and more focused on the social and the economic growth. And I think it's that just shows that there are different bubbles, and the most important thing is to learn how to break out, because all the other literacies, how to understand and how to be able to trust different sources, we have to first of all encounter these different sources. So I think that's the most important thing, to break out of the bubble.
Yeah, and that's a big challenge, breaking out of the bubble. Kerstin, do you have ideas on how we can do that?
Thank you for this question. Well, it is not. I never heard about a literacy called breaking out of the bubble literacy.
We can invent a new one.
But it is a very important skill, I think so, and it has something to communicate with people from different perspectives, with people from different backgrounds, or from different disciplines. And when it comes back to school and the different subjects that you are told during your school time, they are all very close to each other. They mostly are not connected with each other. For example, we heard a lot about in the talk of Friederike about the term socio-scientific issue, that we today face the climate change as a socio-scientific issue, means that we appreciate that it has scientific elements. We have to can understand it from the scientific perspective, which refers to science education, what is our background mostly here. But it also has social implications, as you mentioned. It has political implications. You look upon it from different perspectives, depending on which political background you have, or even what is your background in economological perspectives. So I have not a patency about your question, but I can imagine that it would help for us all to look more upon these interconnections of the different disciplines and bring this better into school, so that students can see about these interconnections earlier than it is the case at the moment.
Yeah, of course, I would strongly agree, because the different important topics of today are interdisciplinary, like climate change. So that's why this is definitely a very important aspect. And Shakked wants to add up on this, please.
Yes, I didn't hear about illiteracy, and I'm bursting out of the bubble. But I think that my fiancé has always said that he's using a lot of Twitter, but he follows a lot of different parties, like not only the one that he voted for, but the other side as well. Now, it's part of being digital literacy and AI literature, because he understands how the algorithm works. The more you follow about the same parties, the algorithm will feed you with the same information and will build the bubble around you. If you follow other parties, meaning you understand how the algorithm works, you have the AI literacy, the digital literacy, you can fight this bubble that the social media can create for you. So if I need to give it a name, I will say that it's digital literacy, AI literacy, in which today in our world, you said before media literacy. I agree that media literacy is really important, but in the online space, mostly I would say digital literacy is the right frame for it in order to fight these phenomena online. And he wants to wait.
Yeah, Thomas.
I totally agree with that, and maybe I want to add one thing more, because it's not only knowing about how social media works, but it's also this moment of taking a second, thinking about, okay, I don't agree with what I'm reading here, but I need to think about it if there is a fair point in what I'm reading. And I think in the literature sometimes it is mentioned as actively open-minded thinking or critical thinking, depending on where you're reading about it. So I think that this one might be a second sort of thing one needs to consider, yeah? For the breaking out of the bubble literacy.
Yeah, so we're talking a lot about such a meta level here, which is really, really interesting. So AI literacy, critical thinking. But on the other hand, in the keynote of Friederike, we heard that also subject knowledge does play a role. So you can know the facts, but actually you believe what you want to believe. Emotion plays a strong role, and also there is this very famous quote, which is sharing is not believing. So sometimes I just have an emotion when I stumble upon a post in social media, and I just share it even if after careful consideration I wouldn't believe it. So all of these mechanisms do play a role. But coming back to the subject knowledge, and maybe starting from a school perspective, Jonas, what do you think, what role does subject knowledge or content knowledge play in a digital society where you need critical thinking to evaluate information on social media?
A huge role, because Thomas just said we need time to think, but we also need time to proof check, actually. And we do have a gap. We have a gap between living in a complex world where we need that knowledge to be a player in this world, but we also have children who are digital natives, but of course you can't generalize that they have the same skills. There are still the aspect of social background, and we have to make sure that we deconstruct this complex world and give knowledge to the children that they can relate to. For example, when it comes to photosynthesis, we start with Van Helmont or Priestley, so easy experiments that the students can understand, and they can see what happens, you know, and they get an understanding of how science works, that you test something, that you have hypotheses in the beginning, and that you prove them, verify them, or falsify them in the end. So that's a very important part of science education and social media education at the moment, and it takes time. The problem is that everything happens so fast nowadays that it really feels that we're behind the tasks that are ahead of us. So it's like very difficult, and lots of us struggle with that because we teach the basics, but it seems like it's not enough. It's not enough, and we can't kind of shorten the gap.
Yeah, it's just like Thomas said, the rocket, not only social media-wise, but also scientific findings-wise, which is flying somewhere ahead of us. Check it.
I agree that knowledge is important, but a lot of researchers in the study of science literacy said and found that the scientific knowledge itself doesn't really help in order to fight misinformation or to use scientific knowledge in everyday lives. However, the understanding of what scientific knowledge is what that's important, the understanding of what scientific consensus is. And for example, one thought that I had while listening to the last answer that Frederica said, it's the understanding of the important to know that science is not always right and that it's developed over time. Now, we trust on science, it's built upon us, and then when the scientific were wrong during COVID, we said, oh my God, they're wrong, it's horrible, we can't trust them anymore. But it's part of science, they learned it as well. So the knowledge that we need to teach is not the facts, it's not the terms, it's not the definitions, it's how science works, what is scientific consensus, what is nature of science, the big elements behind the scene that build science, and that's my 2 pennies on it.
Yeah, and speaking about nature of science, of course, I look at Kerstin because that's
I just
exactly...
wanted to add something to this because it is a quite big advantage of, or more or less a challenge for nature of science education or understanding nature of science as part of scientific literacy, because now we are discussing nature of science for such a long time, internationally even longer than in the German context, but it is not yet so good implemented in school, so it is not yet so much addressed in schools. And social media might be a chance for integrating nature of science into the classroom, because you have so many possibilities to critically think about, for example, posts that you get involved with, or doing your own search and evaluate these. Maybe get in contact with scientists authentically and get to know, for example, a prominent scientist that you hear about in social media, how he posts, how he interacts with his audience. These are all, even to interact yourself with him. You can ask him something, you can address him, you can talk to him, you can even give him a little message. So these are new possibilities to directly getting into contact with science through social media, and we not yet picked this chance so far at its full possibility for science education.
And this is also a very good connection to the topic of interventions, because I will be talking about this tomorrow. There are very, very few interventions, and some of them are actually dealing with authentic contacts with scientists, which can help raise the trustworthiness of science as well. But maybe because we are talking about a school perspective here, I would refer back to Hannes and ask him directly, Hannes, is something like this happening from your experience in your schooling? Like talking about how science works, how the nature of science is, how scientific knowledge is produced. So what's your experience on this?
At least in my school in the last couple of years, that's basically the center of what we're all doing. Because, well, I'm interested in physics and in math and history. And in all of these different classes, it's always how knowledge is created and how the scientific methods, either in like physics, in a physics context, or in a history, socio context. So I think that's what it's about, but it's not really, doesn't use social media, and it lacks the connection to our ways of getting information, because what we're learning is how to get information from either doing experiments or reading books, and most of us do neither of these things on a regular basis. but we get information from social media posts, and I talked about that earlier. For example, in German class, we learn how to analyze poems, for example. But I don't really analyze poems daily. That's not what I do. But what I would like to know how to analyze better is, for example, social media posts. So trying to find out what was the intention of the author who made this post. What is he trying to tell me? What might be his does he maybe have an agenda? We talked about it earlier. And just being better able to understand social media. I think that's something that needs to be implemented in schools. So the connection from how science works to how we see science today. What does science give us normal people? So how do we connect with it? So that's like an like different subject thing, German, for example.
Yeah, thank you very much. So this poem example is very, very prominent. So I'm a German teacher myself, and I'm totally familiar with this argumentation, and I can really understand it. But maybe I can play it back to the teacher, because I have done a study with teachers myself, an interview study, and I asked teachers, do you use social media in the science classroom? That's what you're asking for. And actually, this was a long study, so I started with this, I think, in 2017, and back then, most of the teachers said, oh, no, I can't imagine doing that because I don't use social media myself or use it only to communicate with friends, and it's not authentic. And this seems to get better, but what would you respond to this problem, Jonas?
Yeah, well, we always try to connect the everyday life of the students with school to start at a point we all can agree on, right? And I think it has gotten better because we try to implement something called deeper learning, which means not only gaining knowledge, but also gaining knowledge of what to do with it and where to get knowledge from. One example is in year 8, we were dealing with the digestive system and also eating disorders. And then the next step was, how are eating disorders related to social media? And there are things like, it's called thinspiration. So being on Instagram, following fitness models who tell you to actually keep a diet, to, it was like no food February, something like that, which is really dangerous. So-called teachers that teach youngsters, teenagers, how to keep a strict diet, like 800 calories a day, something like that. So very dangerous, and I thought that was a very authentic context where social media was a big problem in the life of teenagers. So there are definitely fields where it's not, where I would say it's necessary to talk about that, because we've just talked about screen times. If we like it or not, like, students are confronted with this topic, and that's why we have to deal with it.
Okay, so this was a very best practice example, but maybe I can refer 2 questions back to the research perspective here. So what can be done to change this role of teachers to produce more best practice examples like that? And what is maybe already happening in terms of promoting literacies via interventions in the school context from your perspective? So maybe someone.
To pick up the first question, I think it's not only a question about the research, but also a question about regulatories in schools and how we deal with social media in classrooms. Because when you think about the aspect of digital identity, which is taking a big part of people's identity at the current time, the timeline on social media is something very private. I would be very interested for Hannes, how comfortable would you be with sharing your personal Instagram timeline with 20 other students in your classroom? I wouldn't be. So I think to do proper research and to do proper research with authentic material, we need to think about, on the research perspective, about how we deal with this. do we need to make some artificial accounts that we hand out? Are there maybe even school accounts for social media or class accounts for social media necessary, where we can dive into social media but not touch into people's digital identity? So maybe, well, the question for Hannes you don't need to answer, but from the teacher perspective, that would be interesting if how you are dealing with this.
Well, it pretty much depends on individuals. Yeah. So we've got a school account for Lutherschule, for example, which is run by a teacher, but there's like no professional concept behind that. It's more like a teacher who does that and tries to represent more or less what we do in everyday life, like sequences from classes, from school life, additional things we do. Also for marketing reasons, of course. So for parents who want to look us up, Lutherschule at Instagram. Yeah. But it's still, very much depending on individuals. And I think there's much more room to have like a more professional way to deal with social media and in general digital concepts in school. We just talked about literacies when it comes to students, but as discussed, also teachers. Like it's still pretty much our own interest whether we foster our knowledge when it comes to social media, whether we have an account or not. But there's nothing mandatory, you know. So it's very important that we also have seminars and teachers who teach us how to use it in a proper way and who also make us aware of maybe echo chambers or rabbit holes when it comes to teaching about social media. Yeah, because if we don't know it and we give it to our students, I mean, there's a big chance that they don't get it right either. So, yeah.
Yeah, while the Lutherschule is getting many more followers on Instagram, I would pass it over first to Hannes and then to Shakked, who want to elaborate on this more.
So I'm really not qualified to talk on most of these things, but one thing I'm asking myself is, is it even possible that you can teach teachers social media in a way that students perceive it? Because a teacher will never be in the same bubbles or spend the same amount of time on social media as students will, just because that's basically impossible, because you can't tell a teacher now spend 10 hours a day on social media because they couldn't do anything else with their time then. So maybe is it possible to like understand the concepts of how social media works, like with a bubble, that there can be bubble or echo chambers, and then teach teachers that echo chambers exist and what they are, and then that maybe students bring in posts or examples of that, and then you can analyze in class, for example, social media posts. Would that be a possibility, something you could do?
I can't answer that because I actually can't. This is a question that I have been having in my head for years now. So it's good that we talk about it right now, and maybe I can pass it over to Shakked and see what she's thinking about that.
I'll go a bit higher and say I did a big report about post-truth phenomena and different ways that the issue is encountered and how to deal with it, and different solutions and literacies that might help. And as we spoke about, digital literacy is really a big thing. However, as I researched for it, not most of the countries around the world doesn't make it a major. I forgot the word in English. Thank you. Mandatory in the curriculum. So, for example, in England, I know that there are some programs. But, for example, in Israel, although the people say that it's really important to teach digital literacy and everything, it's not mandatory, and teacher has no idea how to deal with this issue. However, I do know that it might change in the next few years, because I read an article that PISA for 2024 will encounter and make people to evaluate information and to learn what cherry picking is and how to evaluate critically information. Now, when it's a mandatory in PISA exam, the countries will try to teach this kind of information. So the world is changing, and people do understand that digital literacy is important. However, as I discussed with different people in the last week that I'm in Germany, we got to the conclusion that in all the world, the education system is 5 steps behind everything that's happening. So it's really, really hard to imagine what it will be, because the kids are really inside this environment and the teacher are not. So it's good. I think the solution has to be from top down, because the teacher will escape it if they can. And I think your idea is really interesting and good to my perspective.
I liked your wording, they will try to teach it. So that goes in line with what Hannes says, and he basically said that a lot of teachers are not able to deal with social media in the science classroom so that it appears authentic to the students. So this seems like a really big problem. So Jonas will maybe elaborate, I don't know, maybe on a solution? But
well, I don't have a solution for that, but I would come back to what we said earlier, to deconstruct, to keep it simple and to foster the basic skills such as reflecting. So what does the use to us? Are we happy with our usage? For example, many of my friends in my bubble have deleted their Instagram accounts because they say, I spend too much time scrolling and wasting on this app without gaining anything. So it's like an infinity pool because there's always something coming, and sometimes even avoiding, like, I don't know, doing whatever, the washing or whatever. It's just like scrolling because it's more comfortable. And you can still reflect that behavior because neither the students nor the teachers know how this is all going to develop. So we can foster those basic skills. What do we want from our lives? Where do you want to go? What are our priorities? And then talk about that. How was our usage last week? Have we postponed anything that was important to us because of social media? Did I get lost in rabbit hole? And I think that's very important, to deconstruct, come back to the basics.
Very interesting thought. Hannes?
After hearing this for the last couple of minutes now, there's this question in my head: can we even win? Is there even a theoretical possibility that we can teach students how to be can be autonomous online again? Because social media platforms will always try to get people down in these rabbit holes, and I think they will change their ways of doing it as long as they need to. And schools will, as you said, always be 5 steps behind. So, can we even go down that road, trying to teach people how to deal with it, or do we need a different approach? Maybe how to deal with the negative effects so using social media a lot has on people.
Jonas looks like that he wants to respond immediately. Maybe you can respond shortly, and then I will turn to Kerstin and Thomas and ask: Can we teach?
I like to compare the usage of cell phones or social media with the usage of cigarettes, like in the 50s, where even doctors recommended smoking is good for you and whatever, and then people smoked in bed, in elevators, on planes, wherever. And now we're much more aware on the dangers of smoking. And I think because the digital natives had parents who didn't learn how to use cell phones, social media, so there was no limits. Limitless accessibility, limitless usage of cell phones, social media, games, whatever, online gambling. And I think now that we are getting much more aware of the dangers of social media, it just takes time that we find a proper way and restrictions and limitations that are healthy for us.
Mm-hmm. Okay, 30 seconds. Okay, before it starts like a dialogue between a student and teacher,
you just mentioned no limits. Today my parents are in the audience, and I had limits. And right now my screen time is down to 3 hours. So maybe all these limits have had an effect on my usage. I don't know. That's just something that might prove your point, right?
Yeah, definitely. But still, I mean, we need to do something to bridge these gaps, maybe also from a research perspective, to empower teachers to maybe teach students or at least provide them some strategies or something. So what can we do there for example, from a science education research perspective?
Maybe it is something that comes to the core question that we are looking upon nowadays at a broader level, to the question of how school works. What is the school culture? So mostly in our minds, because it's our experience of being students at a school, that there is a teacher who has all the knowledge, and there's a student who is getting this knowledge. This is a very unidirectional way of perceiving knowledge or of learning that we are all experienced, and that's why it is so dominant in our perspectives. But the social media aspects and this intergenerational problematic, that the older ones are not that into the problems and that they don't use it and they might not be aware of all these factors, and the younger ones have this knowledge, creates a situation maybe where it is possible to interconnect students and teachers and make them in this specific situation to co-creators of teaching. Maybe if this opening up of a classroom could be possible, it might be a chance to accept that everybody in this setting, the students have a specific expertise. They know about the social media platforms, they know about all the different mechanisms that occur. And on the other hand, there is the teacher who has the content knowledge, who has the experience, who has other expertises that he can bring into this situation. Maybe this could be a way to deal with this specific situation at schools.
Yeah, very interesting thought, changing the learning culture, changing of this thinking. And Thomas, your additions on this?
Maybe I can close the loop and bring back together social media and climate change, because a lot of things I've heard, I think, really connect to the topic of climate change, where we need to deal with mitigation and adaptation when it comes to social media. And another thing that is connected to climate change, I think, is that there's hope. There are a lot of people here in the room working on this topic, and we just need to tackle it, and we will find a solution. If it's the perfect solution and if we will solve it by next year, I would like to disagree, but there are people working on it, and I think we just need to. That's why I'm happy to be here.
Yeah. And this is a very good closing remark, because there are no simple answers to complex questions, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't try to tackle these questions. And I'm aware that we just scratched the surface of different aspects, and I'm also aware that we kind of moved away from the topic of climate change for the last 20 minutes. But I think we did it because we were discussing very general points about the role of education in this whole discourse. So thank you very much for your positions. It was really interesting for me as well, and thank you very much for listening.